Hello, friends, and welcome back to Malicious Compliance Stories. Today's story takes us back to 2008 inside a mammography unit where a radiology assistant found herself caught in the middle of workplace drama fueled by The Secret. When her coworkers decided to weaponize Oprah's favorite pseudoscience and accuse her of bad vibes, things escalated quickly. But before we begin, best way to support our channel is to leave comments, like, and subscribe with the turned-on bell so you don't miss the new video every single day. The Secret to Chaos, when workplace pseudoscience backfires. Around 2008, I was a radiology assistant in a mammography unit, meaning I was the person who ushered in patients, showed them where to put their belongings, gives them the gown and instructions. Another part of my job was keeping the radiology station clean and tidy so that work surfaces were clear and sanitary. Around this time, The Secret was huge and my coworkers were all way into it. For those who don't know, it's a ridiculous pseudoscientific method pushed by Oprah Winfrey that promised you can get whatever you want simply by visualizing and asking the universe for it. The ugly side of this fairy tale thinking is that if bad things happen to you, it's your fault because you invited it by putting bad energy out into the universe. I found it wildly inappropriate that healthcare professionals believe that breast cancer victims had caused their own cancers through negative thinking. I fought with a few of the radiology techs about it, but I was completely outnumbered, so I tried to just keep my head down, focus on patients, and do my job, which included tidying up their O magazines, secret books, and other secret-related materials that they would leave strewn all over the counters. Since they all hated me for not being in their secret clique, they decided to hang up on me and go to the managers with complaints about my attitude. I was called out of work into a disciplinary ambush meeting where I explained my side of things. One of the higher-up managers totally agreed with me and actually defended me, but at the conclusion of the meeting, I was told not to touch anyone else's stuff because there were complaints that I was shoving magazines into the corners and threw away someone's copy of The Secret. I really wish I had, but I actually did not do that. It was a complete lie. So by complaining about me, my idiotic coworkers effectively took away the part of my job which was cleaning up after them. I was no longer allowed to touch their magazines, so they piled up 2 inches deep on every surface, plus empty bottles and yogurt containers, used napkins, cafeteria trays, popcorn detritus, and all other sorts of trash. The workstation looked like a landfill. They'd be absolutely seething about it and glaring at me, but I would sit there reading, happily doing absolutely nothing about it since I wasn't allowed to touch their stuff. Wow, what a ridiculous situation. First off, the secret mindset in a healthcare setting? Yikes. Blaming cancer patients for their illness because they didn't think positive enough is absurdly cruel and unscientific. The fact that these professionals embrace that nonsense so wholeheartedly and then use it as a weapon against you is just next level toxic. And our second story. Out in the camper. I'm the oldest of 4 siblings and was adopted, so I've always carried a bit of a chip on my shoulder regarding rejection and things like that. I realize I can sometimes be overly sensitive about stuff. That said, my younger brother has always had it a bit easier than the rest of us. He got more support, more opportunities, and was often more entitled and arrogant about it. Growing up, he was incredibly cheap. He would always find ways to make me and my other siblings pay the lion's share of vacation expenses, and somehow he always ended up with the best room in the Airbnb, even though we were all contributing. It got pretty annoying. On top of that, he would always claim to have problems with his card whenever the bill came at restaurants. He'd be incredibly argumentative about money to the point where it was embarrassing, and we'd often end up paying for him and his family for years. My family's from New Zealand, and every Christmas we all head back to Mom's house and stay together. Mom and her husband are lovely, but they tend to kowtow to my brother a lot, so what usually happens every year is that my siblings and their families come from different parts of New Zealand or Australia to stay at Mom's, while I travel all the way from the U.S., which is an 18 to 25-hour ordeal with my family. When I finally get there after the long journey, I'm shown to a cramped camper at the back of the property since all the bedrooms are taken up by my brother and his family. This happens every year without fail. I try to joke it off, but deep down it makes me feel like a second-class citizen. The camper doesn't even have AC, so it's really tough to sleep on warm nights, which just adds to the resentment and that chip on my shoulder. So here comes my petty revenge. Recently, Mom started expressing interest in visiting me in the U.S. with her husband. Some of my siblings also chimed in, saying they'd love to visit too. Now, I've been lucky in that my business has been doing well, so I managed to get a nice house about 45 minutes outside the city with a big section and even a pool. Naturally, they all assumed they would be staying in the house like normal. But I had a different plan. Instead of offering them a comfortable room inside, I drove 6 hours to rural Pennsylvania and picked up a tiny vintage camper from Facebook Marketplace. I then flattened out some land, landscaped around it with a little deck, and ran power and water to it. And unlike my experience with the camper at Mom's place, I made sure to install an AC. So now, whenever my family visits, they get to stay out in the camper. I can't wait for them to see it. It'll be a little reminder of how it felt to always be pushed aside and to have my space taken for granted. It might be petty, but honestly, it feels pretty sweet knowing that when they come to visit, they'll be the ones staying outside in the heat while I enjoy the comfort of my home. Sounds like you've always been expected to just grin and bear it while your brother hogged the lion's share of comfort and convenience, and your other siblings quietly went along with it. Your vintage camper setup's the perfect blend of irony and clever payback. They can't really complain about the camper, right? After all, it's exactly what you've had to deal with for years, except you've actually been generous enough to include AC and thoughtful landscaping. And our last story. Trespassing on new farm. We recently bought a 40-acre farm, and while we were thrilled about the move, we didn't realize we'd also inherited a Karen as a neighbor. The farm had been abandoned for nearly 2 years before we purchased it. Before that, it was owned by an older woman who rented the land out to local farmers. The property had been used for corn and beans for decades, but we're turning it into a high-intensity produce farm, which means we'll be in the fields constantly. One of the first days on the farm, I saw a man walking along the path in the fields. He introduced himself as a neighbor and mentioned he'd been walking here for over 20 years. Neighbor: the last owner was fine with it. Hope you're cool with me continuing the tradition. I got a good vibe from him and didn't want to stir the pot, so I let it go, but I did warn him that we had 2 dogs who were protective and would bark or run up to anyone on the land. He nodded and assured me it wouldn't be a problem. I've seen him since, so it didn't feel like a big deal. Then came Karen. The day we moved in, Karen waddled over with her puffy jacket, a clipboard, and what I can only describe as the ultimate Karen expression. Karen: oh, finally, someone bought the place. I hope you'll be better neighbors than the last ones. They were awful. Me: thanks. We're looking forward to settling in. Karen, squinting at me: you're not one of those organic types, are you? We don't need hippies growing weeds and making the property values drop. I smiled tightly and walked away, already sensing what we were in for. Fast forward a few weeks, we're in the Northeast and we just had a huge snowstorm. The next morning, as we stepped outside to check the farm, we noticed fresh snowmobile tracks crisscrossing our property. These weren't harmless trails, they went straight over one of our prepared beds of peony plants. And then there was the cinder block. The snowmobile had clearly hit it, leaving a jagged path where the bed had been. Whoever it was couldn't have missed it. I had my suspicions, and they were confirmed later that afternoon when Karen came stomping over. Karen, crossing her arms: so I heard you're upset about some snowmobile tracks. It's just snow. You'll plant new stuff in the spring anyway. Me, trying to stay calm: Karen, someone destroyed part of a bed we were prepped for peonies. Those plants take years to mature, and hitting the cinder block could have caused serious damage to the rider or the equipment. Karen: oh, for crying out loud, it's not like the last owner cared. You farmers are so dramatic. My husband likes to ride his snowmobile here. He's been doing it forever. It's basically his trail now. Me: Karen, this is private property. You can't just do that. Karen: I'll call the town council about this. You're going to ruin the neighborhood with your fences and weird plants. What if the kids want to sled here? Are you going to stop them too? At this point, I was done being polite. Me: Karen, this isn't a playground, it's a working farm. If your husband damages anything else, I'll have no choice but to report it to the authorities. She huffed, muttered something about city folk ruining everything, and stormed off. A few days later, I noticed something strange in one of our fields: piles of ash, charred wood, and large chunks of metal. It didn't take a detective to figure out where it came from. Karen's fire pit sat suspiciously close to the property line, and with the recent wind, it seemed she or her husband had dumped the remains into our field. I decided to confront her directly this time. Me: Karen, did you or your husband dump your fire pit ash into my field? Karen, laughing: oh, it's just ash. It'll help your plants grow. Me: there were chunks of metal in it, Karen. That could puncture tires or damage equipment. Karen, rolling her eyes: well, maybe if you kept your farm better maintained, this wouldn't be an issue. You should be thanking me for fertilizing your field. That was the final straw. I contacted a surveyor to officially mark the property lines, then put up signs every few feet declaring it private property. Next week, we're having a fence installed, complete with cameras to monitor for any accidental trespassing. The day the signs went up, Karen came over screaming like a banshee. Karen: you can't just put up signs like this. It's so ugly. You're ruining the view for the whole neighborhood. Me: Karen, this is my land. Your snowmobiles, your fire pit, ash, and your attitude are not welcome here. She threatened to call the town council again, claiming the signs were illegal. Me: go ahead. I've already spoken to them and provided all the documentation. Your move. The fence is scheduled for next week, and Karen's tantrums have only escalated, but I've documented everything from the snowmobile damage to her comments, and I'm not afraid to get law enforcement involved if it happens again. It's safe to say Karen and her husband won't be getting any fresh produce from us. Let's just see how long it takes for her to figure out that actions have consequences. Wow, Karen strikes again with her textbook entitlement and absolute lack of boundaries. This isn't a playground, Karen. It's a working farm with real financial and emotional investments at stake. I think you're handling it perfectly, documenting everything, putting up clear signs, and getting that fence installed. It's a shame that instead of enjoying the peaceful neighborly vibe she could have had, Karen decided to declare war on her new neighbors. It's also kind of poetic that her tantrums will now be met with a solid fence and cameras. I'm genuinely curious how long she'll keep up the act when she realizes she has no legal leg to stand on. Hey guys, thank you all for watching the video. I'll see you in the next one.